Hey guys, so back again. So I know that literally was like the last upload where I said I'd be uploading more frequently and being able to kind of have this back and forth with you guys um, in a more personal way, and then I just go like silent for 3 weeks. And the reason for that is just because I was horribly sick, like really, really sick. I went to Vegas and had a great time there, and then the last day that I was hanging out there, I just came down with like a little bug. I don't know what it was. I was just super tired. And then the Monday, when I got back, until about like the Saturday of that week, I was just super ill. So I got tested for COVID and it wasn't that, which was great because, I haven't had COVID yet, at least I think. So I kind of want to keep my streak up. But that really sidelined me from being able to put out content. So like on this channel, and then I had the script for the Attack on Titan video that I just finished. I had that for like 3 weeks, right? And it was just about making sure that I actually made the thing, and got around to that, which I finally was able to do when I felt better. So yes, hopefully now I will be able to actually more frequently upload on the channel. I read through all the comments that you guys left on the post that I submitted, right? Like asking you guys for like ideas. And there was like a lot of really good ones, right? And hopefully I'll be able to actually kind of like use that and anything else that you guys post and comment that you want me to talk about as kind of like fuel for just me sitting down and kind of like making these videos that are kind of like more personal and just kind of like directed at the things that you guys want to hear about. The topic that I kind of wanted to address today was that someone asked me about the accessibility of writing and more specifically, how writing can kind of be made in these different ways, and at different levels of experience and through different mediums, right? And so again, forgive me if I ever blabber because this is all coming like straight off my head. This is like not one of the videos that I made a script for. And so I'll do my best to try to illustrate these things in the best way, in simple ways possible, right? So one of the things that they talked about in the comment was that video games have, like Undertale, have certain writing mechanics that they're able to do, while books are able to have certain writing mechanics they're able to do. And then also just professional writers adhere to certain kind of, not cliches, but kind of like metrics of writing and literary theories, while less mainstream writers are able to kind of have their own unique twists and takes on that. And I think that's a really good point to be able to understand, because writing is so subjective. It can be anything that you want it to, and I think everyone has that different flair and that different taste for it, right? But I guess we can really get into kind of the nitty gritty of like what makes certain writing like really unique, and how to make your own writing so that it's kind of like your own fingerprint, right? And I think the first thing to really talk about in this kind of scope is that writing as a whole, there is nothing new anymore, right? That's the biggest thing to kind of like get out of your mind when you're sitting down in front of a computer, or if you write with pen and paper, sitting down in front of that, you are never going to be unique. That's it sucks. It sounds so, kind of cold, but you are way too late in the writing game to ever have anything that's never been done before, right? We sadly live in like 2022. Now, if we lived in the year like 22, maybe you'd have a shot. But every story that's ever been written has been written, or at least the basis for it, right? And so that's what you understand, like stories as of right now. And if we think about stories as having like a meta writing, stories as of right now are retellings of stories that we've already heard, right? And the bedrock of those stories are what we call cliches. So boy meets girl, boy gets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back, right? So that's a typical kind of like cliche storyline. And even though a ton of people are very much invested in those cliches, there are tons of fictions that work off of changing those cliches, right? And so that's what so many fictions are nowadays. It's the fundamentals of the idea of the story is a cliche, right? And they're cliches because they work, right? A cliche by definition is a story that is so ubiquitous that you already know that it's associated with the type of storytelling or the genre that it's a part of, right? And it only got that way because it has fundamentally worked, right? Like a tragedy ends with death or loss or sorrow or anything like that, or, you know, there's so many different things that I can go into. But it's about how you take the fundamentals of cliches in storytelling and you twist them in your own unique way so that you are appearing to write something supremely unique, right? One of my favorite examples of this, even though it might be a little niche, is the video game Hades. I talked about it just a little bit in a previous video. And in video games, you're not only limited by writing a story, you're limited by the mechanics of the video game, right? And so every video game, well, almost every video game, there's the mechanic of dying, right? It's what keeps the player from just doing whatever, because the threat is that if you do whatever, you will die, you'll lose progress, you'll lose experience, right? And what Hades chose to do, the video game, is that when you die, you would progress the story in Hades by going back to the house of Hades, right? You're the son Zagreus, you're the son of Hades. And every time you die trying to escape the underworld, you go back to the house of Hades, your home. And that's one of the ways that you learn more about the characters, because they know that you've died. The game remembers that you died, right? And while on its face it seems very simple, what that is doing, it's taking the cliche, the understood bedrock of video games, which is kind of like the element of dying or the element of losing progress, and it's transferring that into a narrative element of saying, when you have this thing happen to you, we are going to interweave that into the story, right? And so that's how Hades crafted like a unique story pattern, right? Even though death in a video game is not new, roguelikes are not new, which is kind of like the genre that Hades occupies, it is the video game's usage of a narrative based around the fundamentals and how it uniquely approached it, right? The same thing is kind of like with like Game of Thrones. If you really think about it, George R. R. Martin completely used the fundamentals of like cliches to build up the bedrock of Game of Thrones or Song of Ice and Fire, if you talk about the book series. But then he changed everything, right? So in fantasy fiction, dwarfs lived in caves, very typically, even outside of Tolkien. And they, you know, had huge droves of gold, right? So Tyrion is a dwarf that lives or used to live in Cashley Rock, which is literally like a huge mountain of gold, right? But instead of being able to kind of like go straight forward with that cliche, he turned Tyrion into a literal, a man with dwarfism. And Casterly Rock is not like a cave. It is, well, it's a cave, but it's a castle, it's a mountain, right? And Tyrion, yes, comes from wealth, but he himself is dependent on his father for the wealth. I mean, there's so many that I could think of. So, you know, Rhaegar, Prince Rhaegar kidnapping Lyanna, right? It's a dragon kidnapping a princess in a tower, right? They kept her in the Tower of Joy, the typical kind of like fantasy story, right? And again, there's just more that I've probably forgot more than anything else, more than people know about Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire. But that's examples of being able to say, hey, I can take these things that are fundamental aspects of fiction and I can twist them to be represented in ways that are different, right? And that's how you get so many different outlooks for how any story can be told, right? And it's really important to be able to tell a story in a unique way, because as soon as, and I tell my clients this all the time, as soon as a consumer or a reader or a watcher can guess what's happening next in your story, it's basically as if they're writing your story for you. And what happens is that kind of like devalidates the story and the experience of being a part of it. Because if a person is writing your story for you, then there is absolutely no reason for them to continue on this path, because they can do it themselves, right? So like, why would they devote their time and possibly money to consuming a fiction you created if they can create it themselves? People spend their time and money on fictions that they themselves could not create in their own minds, right? And so by definition, you have to do something that takes their expectations And even if it's based upon the bedrock, the cliches of what is known in literary theory, you take their expectations and you go someplace different with it, right? And you tell that story in a unique way. And it can be literally anything. That's kind of like the best part about there being fundamentals of anything, is that as soon as there's fundamentals, you create kind of like a quote unquote meta about storytelling. And, I talk about first acts, second acts, third acts, intro, midsection, rising action, climax, resolution. And some of the best stories in the world understand that everybody expects those things. So by definition, we are going to alter those aspects of storytelling in order to create a situation where the experience that the consumer has, the viewer has, that the reader has, is unique, right? And sometimes, if you're really good, you don't have to create cliches. There are some really good stories that just hit the nail on the head and are just really good, even if they are stories running tried and true storylines or narratives that we've seen before. They're just really good. Now, I will say, I think it is very difficult to be able to do that because, again, you're standing on the shoulders of giants and you're competing with, like, the foundational authors and creators of fiction all throughout history. You can definitely do it, but it just takes a ton of time and effort. But there are so many, I think, different ways to be able to create those unique stories because there's so many different like components to storytelling. And I think like if you've seen a movie like, The Room, Room. The Room with Tommy Wiseau is completely different. But if you've seen the movie Room, and I cannot for the life of me, I'm so bad with actors' names and actresses' names half the time. But if you've seen Room, and obviously like the major thing with Room, the conflict is that it's a mother and her child trapped in a room, and throughout the movie you have no idea if they're going to survive, what the purpose of them being captive is. And I won't spoil anything because I do want you to have the experience if you're going to watch it yourself. But the movie, I think, completely takes a left turn about halfway through, and it very much is expected to go one way and then completely subverts itself. I guess another better example actually would be Knives Out. It's like a murder mystery, except halfway through the movie they find the murderer. And it transitions into something completely different that we really hadn't seen before, haven't expressed in fiction that way, right? And so that's how you can think about like your own stories, I think, is a really good way to think about it, is by having aspects of your story, right, that that you want to explicate certain themes, have certain, messages, and whatever the thematic and narrative core of your story is, you then think, okay, well, if I want this to be interesting, like what's something past the first thing that something might think of, right? The same can go with like prose when you're writing dialogue. If you're always writing down the first thing that you're thinking of, most likely it's going to be the first thing something else thinks of. I'm sure you've all been in theaters where the character is, they say one part of a sentence and then you mime it to yourself, and lo and behold, the character says exactly what you had mimed to yourself. And that's lazy writing, right? In most cases, because you're writing it before or alongside the author, right? And so whether it be your prose, your dialogue, your descriptions, or your plot points, always think like, what is the easiest thing that came to mind for me? Because that's probably the easiest thing that comes to mind for a reader, right? For the prose and dialogue, an example, could be, she picked the fork up off the table and used it to eat the waffles, right? Which is, a pretty simple sentence. There's nothing wrong with it. Like functionally, it serves its utility. But there are so many different ways to be able to use language in order to say those sentences in a way that somebody else might not think about it. And not giving into the easiest thing causes kind of like that unique aspect of like, oh my gosh, I haven't heard that described that way. So instead of, she picked up the fork and used it to eat the waffles, you can use the dialogue and the prose to be able to give examples of that person's personality, right? If you're writing from like a third person or like a first person, you can use that dialogue and like that word choice or the prose to use the word choice to be able to show a little bit, right? So it could be, she gingerly touched the fork and looked at the mountain of waffles before her. Her brow quivered, sweat beaded on her forehead. This was the largest meal she had in 4 days, and it wasn't getting any smaller just looking at it, right? So like, essentially it's the same, it's the same sentence, right? And that's just like completely off the top of my head, but it's the ability to kind of like add uniqueness and drama to that, right? And in the same way, if we're going to talk about not just prose or dialogue, but like construction of stories and how to make them unique, what we could do is think about, okay, well, if I want to write a rags to riches story, let's just say, we're going off a cliche. Yeah, I'm going to have my character, start out really poor, and then he's going to invent something. And then, like overnight he becomes a sensation. And then I'm going to write kind of like the moral degradation of this character. And how money changes him, and then he's gonna learn the moral lesson by like the end of the story, and then become a better person and learn to use his money for for good, right? You could definitely keep to that, but if you want to think about like, okay, how can I change this rags to riches to enhance the story in a way that people might not know? You could very easily think, I'm gonna have a character, and they're gonna be poor at the start of the fiction, and they're going to gain a ton of money overnight because of something they did, an invention, but they're going to keep their wealth secret, because for this person, they do not want the attention, they do not want the notoriety, and eventually through the story they're going to have to make a decision, and something important to them is going to happen, and they can either be selfish and not allow the money to affect other people and possibly harm other people who are close to them, or they're going to give up their anonymity and come forward with this money that they have, right? And through the choice, and if we say this character chooses, right, like the lack of anonymity, right, like the tension is between whether or not they'll remain anonymous with their money and safe, or go into uncharted territory, give the money to somebody else. We could say that is the riches part of the rags to riches. But then you start to investigate how the lack of anonymity changes the character, right, into something different than he was before, or maybe he likes it, maybe he becomes corrupted, and maybe his values and judgments change, right? And then through his journey, and possibly even characters that appeared before who liked him being more anonymous, he learns how to have a better control over his money, right? How to be philanthropic, but also how to remain true to the person that he was before the money affected him, right? And even though, again, completely off the top of my head, that is like, a lot of it is based on execution, but that is a way of being able to subvert a tried and true narrative and keeping kind of like that core scaffolding of what the story is, but being able to say, I'm going to change aspects so that even though I have to start at rags and I have to end at riches, and there has to be some sort of moral lesson in between, I can still be unique enough to tell a story that someone hasn't heard before, right? Because that's all people are looking for. They're not necessarily looking to, have the next great American novel or, great cinema masterpiece, right? Most of the time, people are just looking for something that they had not seen before. And being able to create those types of things is playing with cliches. It's playing with the foundation of narratives and stories in order to be able to craft something that you have personally made unique. And that's, I think that the greatest weapon that a writer has is that their own life has put them in a situation to make things that nobody else can make, right? Nobody can tell your story the way you can. Nobody can think the way you can. Not if you put effort into it uniquely, because we are all so different. No one lives the same life. I think it's really upon every writer, and it is demanded from every good writer to be able to put the work in, to be unique and to tell stories in ways that people want to hear, right? Because I think at the end of the day, writing is going to continuously get more and more crowded with the fictional space that we have. And the only way to kind of like stand out is to be able to be unique, and that's like 90% of the battle. Like literally build it, they will come. Because as long as you can tell a story in a way that people haven't heard before, they'll want it. Doesn't matter. Almost like there's an audience for every story. So that's kind of like my thoughts on that matter. I know I'm going on for a really really long time, but this is kind of, I think, the format of what I'm going to try to do. Again, you guys tell me what you want. I'll try to be more frequent, right? As long as I'm not sick or traveling, and I do travel a lot. But ask those questions. If anything more specific, just let me know. And I'll try to address that, guys. So, as always, it was a pleasure, and I'll talk to you all again soon.